The hidden compartment. The oil lamp guttered, a frantic dance of shadows against the library's limestone walls. Elias, youngest scribe of the scriptorium of Caesarea, should have been asleep hours ago. But sleep was for the incurious. His fingers, stained with oak gall ink, traced the familiar grooves of the codex he was meant to be copying Paul's letter to the Romans. Yet his mind wandered the wider deserts of Revelation. Were these the only words, the only stories? Driven by a whisper in his soul, he ran his hand along the underside of the ancient copying desk, a habit born of restless energy. A splinter caught his thumb. Wincing, he pressed. Not a splinter, a tiny metal catch. With a quiet click, a section of the paneling no wider than his hand swung inward. Dust, ancient and fragrant with papyrus and myrrh, billowed into the air. Inside the compartment lay 3 scrolls, their casings plain, without the ornate labels of the canonical texts. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum sounding an alarm of sacred trespass. This was a secret library, a forbidden one. With trembling hands he unrolled the first. The script was Aramaic, but the tales, they were unlike any Genesis or Psalm. The title, faded but legible, read, "The Chronicle of Barakel, the Stone, Soft Giant, and the Kingdom of the Moss, Kin." His breath caught. A giant? Not a destroyer like Goliath, but one whose story began with lonely tears that watered tiny forests upon his own shoulders. Elias glanced over his shoulder, the vast, silent library suddenly feeling watchful. He had stumbled not upon simple discarded drafts, but upon a lost world. The unwritten pages. The tale of Barakel and the Mosskin. Barakel was so large he mistook mountains for stools and rivers for rivulets. His solitude was absolute, for even the clouds brushed only his knees. One day, weeping from loneliness, his salty tears fell upon an ancient oak on his collarbone. To his astonishment, tiny luminescent sprites the Mosskin sprang forth, nurtured by his grief. They were no taller than a barley seed, with wings of dandelion fluff and voices like crickets. They did not fear him. Instead, they taught him the subtle language of root and rock, of patience and minute perspective. "Great One," their elder chimed, "size is not strength. Awareness is. You hold ecosystems upon your skin. You are not a monster. You are a world." Together, they thwarted a drought not by moving rivers, but by teaching the giant to whisper to the clouds, his breath a gentle wind that carried rain to parched villages below. The tale was one of symbiotic friendship, where the smallest held the greatest wisdom. The scroll of Thalassa, mermaid queen of the Phoenician kings. The second scroll bore the wax seal of a trident. This was the Dialogues of Thalassa and Hiram. It recounted how Thalassa, a mermaid of such majesty her tail shimmered with deposited sapphires, had risen in the harbor of Tyre. She did not sing sailors to their doom. Instead, she proposed a covenant to King Hiram. In exchange for cedar wood for Solomon's temple, the Phoenicians must cease harvesting the great sea snails for purple dye during their breeding season. "The sea's wealth is infinite only if its rhythm is respected," she intoned, her voice the sound of waves in a conch. She detailed the migratory paths of tuna, the coral cities that cleanse the water, and the great net of life connecting all creatures. King Hiram, the scroll claimed, instituted the first maritime conservation laws based on her wisdom, centuries before such a concept would be named. Elias sat back, stunned. These were not mere fables. They were theological parables of ecological stewardship and cosmic friendship, wrapped in a dazzling mythos rivaling the stories of Jonah or Noah. The Council of Shadows. Why they were left out. Weeks passed in clandestine study. Elias cross-referenced texts, seeking answers. He learned of the Apocrypha books like Maccabees or Tobit, included in some canons but not others, works of disputed authenticity but generally respected. These scrolls, however, were different. They were pseudepigrapha, falsely ascribed, often more imaginative, attributed to ancient patriarchs but clearly composed later, bursting with angelic encounters and cosmic journeys. His research led him to the towering event that cast the long shadow over his discovery, the Council of Nicaea. While primarily concerned with the divinity of Christ, the council epitomized a wider, centuries-long process of canonization. Bishops and scholars debated. What reinforced the core narrative of fallen redemption? What was universally accepted across the sprawling Christian world? What was useful? The master scribe, catching Elias's exhausted look, sat beside him one evening. "You look like a man who has seen ghosts, boy." "Stories, master," Elias ventured. "Ones that feel true yet are absent from our codices." The old man nodded, his eyes knowing. "The river of revelation is broad, Elias, but to carve a channel for the ages, banks must be built. The tale of the giant and the sprites? Beautiful, but does it elucidate the nature of sin or the promise of a Messiah? The mermaid's ecology lesson? Profound, but is it central to the covenant between God and Abraham?" The council sought cohesion, a unified text to anchor a faith, not a library of every beautiful speculation. The dilemma was laid bare. The criteria were theological alignment, apostolic lineage, and widespread liturgical use. These forgotten scrolls failed on all counts. They were too local, too fantastical, too focused on earthly harmony over heavenly salvation. They were silenced not by malice, but by the relentless editorial pressure of building a portable, definable orthodoxy for an empire. The ripple through time, a world that might have been. Elias began to dream in alternatives. What if Barakel's story had been read in every church? Would a culture that saw giants as potential guardians of minute life have developed a different relationship with nature, seeing holiness not just in towering mountains, but in every moss and mite? Would the concept of stewardship have been woven into Scripture with the vividness of Thalassa's covenant? He imagined medieval bestiaries alive with compassionate giants. He pictured papal encyclicals on ocean health quoting a mermaid queen. These weren't just lost stories, they were lost frameworks. They presented a worldview where wisdom came from unexpected alliances, sprites and giants, humans and merfolk, where righteousness included environmental ethics, and where the divine narrative was a tapestry wider and weirder than anyone dared believe. The very absence of these tales challenged a monumental assumption that the canonical Bible is a complete collection of God's communication rather than a curated library, shaped by very human hands, politics, and needs. What other perspectives, matriarchal, animistic, cosmic, were shelved in history's hidden compartment? The enduring whisper. The dawn of his decision arrived. The master scribe knew. The authorities might soon know. The scrolls could be condemned to the flames as dangerous curiosities. Elias made his choice. He would not destroy them, nor would he let the scriptorium claim them for oblivion. He thought of the Qumran caves, where the Essenes hid their libraries, preserving them in jars for millennia. He would become a keeper, not just a discoverer. One moonless night, he carefully re-rolled the scrolls, placed them in a sealed clay jar, and journeyed to a remote cave overlooking the sea. As he hid the jar, he felt he was not burying a secret, but planting a seed. Stories, like seeds, possess a stubborn resilience. They wait for the right climate to sprout. He returned to his desk, the hidden compartment empty. But his mind was full. The unwritten Bible was not a threat to his faith. It was an expansion pack for his imagination. It proved that the human hunger for the divine, for meaning, and for connection had always burst forth in a wild, untamed proliferation of narratives. The end, or the beginning. Elias's story is a hook into our own curiosity. What other ancient secrets mold our present? What almost histories linger in archives, caves, or even digital servers today? The quest isn't to rewrite the past, but to rediscover its full, glorious, messy complexity. To remember that for every canon, there is a vibrant, whispering Apocrypha. And sometimes, the most profound truths are found not in the central text, but in the margin, waiting for a curious scribe like you to find them. So, what forgotten narrative will you go looking for? The adventure is just a question away.